Hi, I'm Graham Harvey. For the last 20 years or so, I've been a kind of farm minister for Ambridge. That's the fictional village in the BBC's long-running radio drama series, The Archers. It's been my job to decide the fortunes of those handful of farming families we've all got to know so well. But now I'm delving into the real countryside, in search of good food. Proper, healthy, nutrient-rich food, or as I like to call it, real food. Back in the early 1950s, when the Archers started, most of our food was produced on traditional mixed farms. It came from a countryside teeming with wildlife. But in the intervening years, farmers have come to rely more and more on chemicals, chemical fertilisers and pesticides. As a result, much of our wildlife has vanished, soils are eroding, animals are treated like machines, and many everyday foods are robbed of nutrients and contaminated with pesticides. We really can't go on treating our countryside or our own bodies like this. After a lifetime's interest in farming, I'm now sure that those traditional farms of the 1950s could feed us a great deal better and more sustainably than modern chemical agriculture. We need a countryside revolution that puts real food and a living countryside ahead of biotech company profits. So join me as I seek out the pioneers and visionaries who are working to bring wildlife back to our countryside and proper food back onto our plates. Today I'm in Cholderton on the Hampshire-Wiltshire border, not far from Stonehenge. With me is farmer Henry Edmunds, and on a sunny summer morning we're looking at his wonderful flock of pedigree Hampshire Down sheep, the flock established by his great-grandfather well over a century ago. They're grazing on a remarkable and long-forgotten crop. Just how remarkable, Henry's about to explain.
Now this is sandfoin here. This is a variety that my father saved from extinction. It's Hampshire common sandfoin, and you can see got wonderful flush. We've had no rain to speak of since April. Just a couple of showers, that's all, and look at it. It's green, succulent, beautiful forage, and of course the sheep do extraordinarily well on it because it has higher feed value than any other forage crop that can be grown in this country.
And it used to be very common on these chalk downlands, didn't it?
Yeah, it was. It was all widespread all over the area, but of course when people started going into mass cereal, industrial type farming, it was all ploughed out and gone, and nobody kept it going. Excepting my father.
I first came to look at this crop, when was it? In the mid-1970s when I worked for Farmers Weekly, and it was a remarkable crop then.
Yeah.
I saw it in flower. I mean, it's really great for pollinators, is that right?
It is fantastic. Bumblebees, honeybees. It produces more honey than any other crop you can grow in Britain. Tremendous crops of honey. Enough really to, apparently it's sort of beekeeper's elixir. Nothing is better.
And we looked at this crop earlier this year when it was in flower, and it was actually humming with bees and other pollinators, wasn't it?
Yeah, no, it was very good. But not this year. I have to say there weren't the bees about that I would expect as big. Something happened last winter, or has happened in the last few months, and bee populations generally seem to be pretty low. In my understanding. But whatever, we certainly saw quite a few out here, but not as many as I'd like to see.
Because this is such a great crop, it's so resistant to drought. If we went back 50 years or 100 years, we'd have seen this all over the South Chalk Downlands. Is that right?
Everywhere. There were about 7 regional varieties of it. Essex common sandfoin, Cambridge common sandfoin, Vale of Glamorgan common sandfoin, extraordinarily enough, Hampshire common, and then there was Cotswold common, and I dare say a couple of others I've forgotten about.
I'd like to talk a bit about your wonderful sheep flock, but I'm going to bring in another guest with us today, and that's Philip Lymbery, who's Director of Compassion in World Farming. Now, Philip, this flock and this crop are part of an integrated mixed farming system, which is a kind of system which I gather you at Compassion are very keen to see.
It's something which I very much see as the future. We've got a problem at the moment across Britain, Europe. increasingly across the world, where farm animals are being taken off of the land and they're being put into factory farms, into cages, crates in confinement, and their feed is being grown elsewhere, usually in chemical-soaked monocultures. And what this does is essentially undermines wildlife. It leads to ecosystem collapse. It starts to see the soils deplete and erode. It knocks the pollinators like bees for six, and so on. And so you find that the countryside starts to break down. And it's no surprise then, over the last decades, where this monoculture-driven industrial form of agriculture has come about, that we've seen a collapse in once common farmland bird numbers, a collapse in our bees, and we're starting to see serious collapse in the country's soils. So to see this kind of system, which is essentially working with nature rather than against nature, where animals are integrated and are rotating around the farm in a way which is much more environmentally enhancing, and it's better for the animal welfare too. It's a joy to see.
Now, Henry, this is a system which you inherited to some extent, did you? This is very much a traditional system, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, it is. It's completely traditional. Nothing original about it at all. It's what our grandparents did and great-grandparents. And the thing is, they learnt by experience, and they knew you had to look after the soil in order to maintain fertility. And basically, I'm just continuing that tradition.
But look, I've just driven down here from Somerset. I've driven past Stonehenge, I've looked across these chalk downlands, and everywhere you look you see monoculture. Why has our farming gone in this direction?
Well, of course, one of the main problems is farmers have been, when they've gone to college, they've been taught that's the way forward. You've got to press on with technology, you've got to be modern, and it just so happens that being modern happens to involve buying massive amounts of inputs. And that's where the whole rot starts, because a lot of companies are making an awful lot of money out of selling chemicals and fertilizers and everything else to farmers, and that's a situation they want to continue. But it is completely unsustainable and extraordinarily damaging to the environment.
You'd go along with that, Philip, presumably, would you?
Absolutely, and it's great to hear Henry saying that. I mean, when I say it from Compassion in World Farming standpoint, and when I write about it in Farmageddon, there are some in the farming community who are very dismissive of my view, and they go rhubarb, when actually it's become increasingly obvious that this rush to modernity in farming is actually old-fashioned, because it's old-fashioned thinking. When did it start? It started in the 40s and 50s. We've got thinking here which is 60, 70 years old, and we're still calling it modern, even though it's leading to the collapse in the countryside. It's done nothing for farm animal welfare. It's done nothing for sustainability, and it's done precious little for farmers too, because in that time, in that 50, 60, 70 year period, farmers in Britain and across Europe have been going out of business like farming is going out of fashion.
And of course there's that forgotten sector, the farm worker. When I started working on farms in the 60s, I don't know how many farm workers are in this country. I don't know, probably 70, 80,000 or maybe 100,000 people working on farms. That's a whole class of employment which has been obliterated. And if all those people had worked in one or two factories, there would have been an outcry about it. But there's been no outcry because it's been invisible to most of the population and the politicians and the economists. So we have depopulated the countryside, is that right, with this intensive approach?
We absolutely have, and we can see this in modern times in Poland, where there has been a distinct push in the last 10-15 years as Poland has come into the European Union, driven by Brussels, to essentially get this peasant anachronism as some Brussels bureaucrats see it, driven off of the land. Get the small farmers out of the way and let big business flood in with all of its chemicals and its machinery. And that's where it's going wrong. And it's really interesting to see that there is a definite correlation, in my view, between the number of people working in the countryside, living and working in the countryside, and the amount of wildlife. As people are driven out of the countryside, then wildlife declines too. There's two ways that you can make food. You can make it through people, through labour, if you like, or you can make it with capital, with money. And this modernity, this 70-year-old, actually old-fashioned thinking, is all about let's throw money at the thing, throw money at producing food. And what do we get for it? We get a countryside which is denuded of wildlife, denuded of people, and actually produces poor quality stuff for our plate too.
And Henry, you'd go along with that. You're working a very traditional system here, and you still employ a lot of people on this farm, don't you?
Yeah, we do. I mean, 12, 14 people, full-time. I mean, instead of spending money on agrochemicals and fertilizers, I'm spending it on labour instead. So that way we're able to maintain skills, rural skills, looking after cattle, looking after sheep. These have been lost. All over the country. What is the cost to this country of the loss of experience that we've suffered? Because all these farm workers, hundreds of thousands of them, were just made redundant and shoved off. Highly experienced people. I've been brought up with people, like wonderful people, real experts. And they've just been told they were redundant, they've lost the heart and they've gone. And that we'll never get them back again. Well, a lot of them are dead now, of course, because it's been going on for so long now. There's just a sort of irreparable loss of experience. It's
a national tragedy.
It's a disgrace. It's a disgrace. And I mean, look at here. Now we're surrounded. We've got lovely hedges here, nice, thick, overgrown hedges.
I was going to ask you
and look,
about
there
your
the
hedges.
swallows working away, aren't they? It's great, isn't it? And I mean, I've had a lot more swallows. I think a lot have pushed on through. But the thing is, now, if we get industrial agriculture in here, the first thing they'll do, all those hedges are out. Woomph. And all this, where you've got a patchwork of fields, and they're reasonably sized fields, but not for not when you've got a John Deere combine with a 40-foot header. So let's have them all out. We'll get them all out, push them up in a heap, and of course, and burn them. And as soon as you've done that, where's all the habitat gone? The birds have got nowhere to nest. The voles, shrews, they've got nowhere. The barn owls have got nowhere to hunt. So everything goes. I mean, a classic example. When was it? Yes, 2012. Because I do work with the Hawk Conservancy a bit, and they were monitoring, I think, it was about 120 barn owl nests. Now, we had that cold weather that year in February, and they monitored all these nests, and they found that only 2 barn owls fledged chicks that year. Only 2 of the 120 nests. And the extraordinary thing is that one was a woman in Reading who was actually feeding day-old chicks that she bought from the pet shop. You can buy those frozen chicks. She was feeding them to this barn owl, and that was picking them up and taking them back to the nest. Well done her. The only other one that was successful was a pair of barn owls here, which have got no supplementary feeding at all, and they did it naturally because I've got a diversified habitat. Whereas everybody else has failed. It says it all, but it also shows the extent of the problem, doesn't it?
It does indeed.
It's that bad.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Before we leave this field and look at another great piece of work that you're doing, Henry, I know you both share a great passion about birds, so I'm going to ask you about corn buntings. I think you've got some nesting pairs here.
Yes, we have. I mean, it is always going to be a problem with, because when we're cutting silage, cutting hay, and there is always going to be. It's very, very difficult to totally guarantee you're not going to cut a nesting bird out, but we do what we can. We try. So what I do is, as you can see, we've left wide headlands all along the hedges. Now, I had a very, very helpful chap here a few years ago who spent all day here just watching to see where the corn buntings were nesting. And in his view, and he spent hours here, they were pitching in and nesting near the bottom of the hedges. So as a result of that, I leave wide edge down the hedges. And subsequent, I have seen every year we're seeing juvenile corn buntings. So, some might go, which is a tragedy, of course, but we certainly we're getting quite a lot through, and numbers are increasing year on year. This year, in this very field, in February, I was standing just over there past the sheep, and a great sort of river of corn buntings flew past me. It was an extraordinary sight, and they were all, pairs, singles, 5, 6s, and they went all the way across the field, settled over that top corner. So as they were in a sort of a river, I was able to count them. We had 85 corn buntings that were feeding in this very field, which just shows we are providing the right habitat for them as well.
You must be delighted to hear that, Philip.
Oh, goodness. Yeah, that's such a rare occurrence these days. I was looking at the recent report on corn buntings in Hampshire, and it's perilous. They're down to little more than a handful of pairs across the county, and in the last decades, the numbers of corn buntings that used to be very abundant across the countryside, they've declined by upwards of 90%. I remember 40 years ago when I was a boy, I used to cycle through, I was in Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire then, I used to cycle through the countryside, and there was this sound, this jangle of keys like sound that would be a regular accompaniment of my bike rides through the countryside, from wires, from fence posts, from hedges. You don't hear that anymore. Henry does, of course, but this is a beacon in what has become a desert for this species, and it's not just corn buntings. It's a general trend across farmland birds, which is worrying because the farmland habitat is the most common habitat across the countryside. 70% of Britain's entire land surface is farmland. So what happens on that land really matters to so much else. And if the corn bunting is an indicator of the health of that countryside, then sadly the countryside in Britain, not here on Henry's farm, but generally speaking, is in a very bad way.
And it's a good indicator species of farmland birds particularly, is it, the corn bunting?
Corn bunting is, it's a good species because it is one that has long been associated with the farming environment, and it's called the fat bird of barley, for example. It's one of the
fat bird of barley. I love it.
One of the sort of the other sort of local type terms that it would be called by. So it's a good farmland indicator. It's a specialist bird, and what we've seen is that specialist birds in the countryside are not doing well. The ones that manage to make a living in what has become an increasing green desert are the jack of all trades, like carrion crows and wood pigeons and things of this nature.
Yeah,
they're bucking the trend, but the specialists, and after all, many birds are specialists because they've adapted over millions of years to fill an ecological niche. Many of those specialists are going to the wall. And
presumably the traditional farm offers a lot more niches. I mean, because of it's a mixture of crops and animals. It produces a whole kind. And is that why traditional farmland can be so rich in biodiversity and birds in particular?
Yeah, I think traditional farming, with its multitude of habitats, with animals integrated with crops, with its hedges and things of this nature, provides those habitats, provides that food. Putting the flip side, what does monoculture farming, the intensive industrial farming, which has become seen as modern, but in my view is now 70 years old kind of farming, what that does is it leads to the fields getting bigger and to chemicals coming in, and as the fields get bigger, then things start to disappear. The trees disappear, the hedges and the bushes disappear, and the chemicals take away the wild flowers. And when those wild flowers go, so too do the seeds and the insects that are needed by those birds, like the corn bunting, as well as the bees, the butterflies, and just about everything else disappears.
Now, as long as I've been writing about agriculture, which is a long time, I started in the mid-60s as a student, we've been told by a section of the farming lobby that we have a choice between biodiversity, if you like, or nature, if you like, and productive agriculture, and if we're going to feed the world, we can't have both. Now, I'd love to hear both your takes on that view. Henry, what do you think?
Yeah,
of that?
well, of course, it's complete rubbish. You know, we demonstrate here. Of course, you can feed huge numbers of people organically, as we do it here. And the point is that the system they're advocating it's a one-way street to nowhere. Because another 50 years of it, they won't get any crop at all. And then what are we going to do? There'll be no food for anybody.
Well, I suppose the assumption is there'll be some new technology in the wing.
Of course,
to feed us
there's
all.
always some wonderful solution, yeah. But no, it's a nonsense. We have to look after what we've got. And, you know, going back to the sandvine here, you know, this is a crop. It has sort of global implications, really. These deep-rooting leguminous crops. To start with, right, we've got rising levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. What are we going to do about it? Well, to start with, growing something like this can make a major contribution. The sandvine is producing, it has 5 or 6 tons to the acre of root. So that's going straight down into the chalk. And of course, that basically is tying up 5 or 6 tons of carbon straight away. So it's taking it out of the atmosphere and it's putting it into the ground where it's locked up. And also, of course, you get the rotting debris of the leaves and the grass and everything else. So that's more. So point is, grow a field of wheat, you're not locking up anything. It's just stripping out the organic matter in the soil. Stripping it out, fertility is going, and it's all going up into the atmosphere. So high input crops are highly pollutive. You've got the problem with the nitrogenous fertilizer, of course. Atmospheric nitrogen going up, whereas here everything is being taken down and it's totally sustainable. You could go on doing this for years. And I even noticed this recently. I was walking across sandvine fields and Lucerne when that really hot weather was on, and they were noticeably cooler. So basically, you've got natural air conditioning going on as well. Because they're so deep rooting, they're able to get that moisture from down, and of course they push it up and it's going out through the leaves. It's actually cooling the atmosphere. So you can see, if you were growing sandvine or lucerne or red clover or other legumes on a huge scale, which is what we need to do as a nation, as the world, we need to do this. That would help cool things down a bit.
We hear all this propaganda, if you like, from the scientists that we need GM crops to feed the world and new technologies are going to be our only hope. What we're saying here is that we have the technology, we have the system that will feed the world sustainably and give us all this wonderful environment as well. Is that right, Philip? Would you agree with that?
I absolutely agree with that, and I think the thing we have to ask ourselves is, what is all this GM really for? Well, actually, statistically, when you look at GM crops, cereals and soya, the majority of it statistically isn't feeding the world, it's feeding factory farms, and that's a very different proposition. And here's why: because factory farms are about taking farm animals off of the land where they produce something we can't eat, like grass, into something we can, meat, milk and eggs. We take them off of that pasture and we put them into cages, crates and confinement, and we grow their feed elsewhere using chemical crops and GM and what have you, and then we feed that crop back to those farm animals, who then waste the vast majority in terms of calories and protein in conversion to that meat, milk and eggs. Now, to put a figure on it, globally, every year we waste enough food that way to feed between 4 and 5 billion extra people on the planet. Now, that's not to say that 4 to 5 billion extra people on the planet would be a good idea, because environmentally it would not all at the same time. It's to say that actually we can feed the world without GM and with less farming, not more.
That's really encouraging. That's a really optimistic picture. Let's leave it at that point, because I know, Henry, you've got some other interesting work you do on this farm, and it's about the restoration of traditional chalk grassland. Maybe we could go and have a look at that.
Yeah, that'd be great, Graham.
That'd be terrific.
Now we're in a rather noisy place. We're just a few hundred yards from the busy A303 trunk road, which goes from the West Country to London. And it sounds quite busy today, but where we are is a remarkable piece of old chalk grassland, of the sort that would have been all over these southern chalk downlands 100 years ago, but which now has become very scarce, and which you, Henry, have been recreating really over the last 30 or 40 years. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Graham. Yeah, I mean, this was a piece of ground that was all sort of fenced off. It wasn't being used for anything. And when I took on the management of it, I realised it needed grazing, it needed a bit of scrub clearance and things like that. So I instigated those changes, and I introduced grazing at particular times of the year. And I also helped boost the seed bank by throwing wildflower seed all over the place, which I harvested in the area. And now it's turned into the most, 40 odd years later, it's turned into the most fabulous site. And we've got lots of rare butterflies here, like the Adonis blue, the chalk-hill blue. It's a very good colony for the Duke of Burgundy fritillary, and a lot of rare plants here, including things like meadow clary. We've got that growing out here naturally, so it's very satisfying, and I get a lot of pleasure from it.
We're here now in middle of August, and it's probably past its best floristically. Is that right? If I'd been here a month or two ago, what might I have seen?
Yeah, I mean, a month ago it was absolutely humming, and there was still a lot of rock rose flowering. There's carpets of rock rose here, lots of brown argus butterflies on it, and the chalk-hill blues. They'll still see a few chalk-hill blues now. There's bastard toad flax is another very rare plant growing up near the top corner here, and also there would be the lovely yellow flowers of the field fleawort. There's only literally one other site in Hampshire for that plant, so I have to be very careful with that. I usually put guards around a few plants that we have to enable them to seed properly, and this year I can tell you that I guarded 6 plants and they all seeded successfully, so it means that they will keep the population going, because the trouble is that rabbits insist on nailing the flowers, so of course it can't seed. So anyway, I make sure that doesn't happen. And just a total proliferation. Horseshoe vetch, for example, carpets and carpets of the yellow horseshoe-shaped flowers on the ground. Of course, that's the food plant of the chalk-hill blue and the Adonis blue, and also a devil's bit scabious. We might see some of that flowering soon. That's the food plant of the marsh fritillary. We don't have marsh fritillaries here at the minute, but if I can get the population of devil's bit scabious up, I'm hoping we might be able to get a population going. So it goes on. It's building life, putting life back into the system, and lots of birds nesting in this scrub here. As you can see, we've broken it all up, and so they can access it, different territories, and 5 or 6 different warbler species nesting here alone.
One of the things that strikes me as I look at this, I think it's wonderful because of the richness, it's biodiversity. But I guess a lot of people would look at this and say, well, this is scrub, wasteland, isn't worth much. Not very neat and tidy like so much of the farmland around here. What's your comment on that?
Yeah, well, you've hit the nail on the head, but you can't, all this neat and tidiness, it's achieved by chemicals and excessive cultivation, so it's hardly desirable. And obviously nature does not want neat and tidiness. Nature wants untidy corners where it can hide and find refuge in difficult times, and this is what we're offering here.
Philip, have you seen much of this chalk grassland as you go around the country?
I've seen a lot of chalk grassland because I used to live amongst it, but a lot of it is very neat and tidy, and I agree with Henry that neat and tidy should be reserved for gardens rather than farmland. And I think that having a diversity of habitats and leaving it more natural is what we're going to have to do for the future, because the way that we're going on with the chemical monocultures, with making everything so neat and tidy, with this industrial approach, is that we are seeing a real erosion in our soils, not just on chalk, but across the country, across Europe and across the world, which is why the United Nations warns that if we don't do something, if we don't move away from, frankly, land-destructive practices, then our soils have 60 harvests left before they're gone.
It's shocking, isn't it, that thought? And it's incredible, really. We're such a clever species that we've got ourselves in this state that our primary producing capital of food is so precarious.
Absolutely. And what it means is, quite frankly, that a child born today won't even reach what we understand as retirement age now before he or she witnesses the death of food as we know it. And that's a very frightening prospect, because at that time we're going to be a world of perhaps 10 billion people. 10 billion people, no food.
Coming back to this chalk grassland, we are inherently not the most productive end of the farming spectrum. How would you manage this? And yet, I mean, it strikes me as amazing that if we went back 100 years, this sort of grassland wasn't all over the chalk grassland because it looked good or offered biodiversity or haven for birds. It was there because it was somehow integrated into the farming system. Couldn't we do that again so that we get much more of this chalk grassland?
Yes, of course we could, because the thing is, if we can get back to some mixed farming system, we make sure all the steep hilly land is put down to permanent pasture like this, and then that is grazed by cows and sheep and other herbivores, whatever, and we only grow the crops on the more fertile, deeper soils where we can do so in a more sustainable way. I mean, currently a lot of this land, the steep hilly land, is all being ploughed up, and the soil is being washed off, eroded down into the bottoms, and it's just it's just hopeless. I mean, it means you have to use more and more fertilizer on those steep banks in order to get a crop off them. So it's totally counterproductive, and in a few years there will be no soil left anyway, so you won't grow any crops at all. So basically that's what we have to do. So get all the steep ground back into this, and then we can start seeing nature repairing all this waste ground that we're looking at the minute.
Philip, you live in Hampshire. You must see a lot of degraded chalk land, do you, and soil erosion going on?
Well, yeah, and soil erosion you can see, particularly when it rains. You see what on a sunny day will be gin-like water flowing through the chalk streams in Hampshire. After rains, you see them running cappuccino brown, where all the soil is rushing in there, and it sounds it sounds apocalyptic to say that, you know, in 50-60 years the soils may be gone, but I would reiterate that this is a United Nations prediction, having gotten close to the data, scientific data. And what's more, our own DEFRA Secretary of State here in the UK is sounding the alarm even more urgently. He believes that in Britain we have perhaps 30 to 40 years left in our soils.
This is Michael Gove.
This is Michael Gove, the DEFRA Secretary of State, the man in charge of agriculture and the environment. And what I really welcome about Michael Gove is that he talks like someone who really gets the fact that without a thriving environment, you can't have a thriving farming system. So often, the likes of, I'm going to name them, the National Farmers Union. I've spent decades debating with the National Farmers Union, who seem, to me at least, to come across as if it's a pitched battle between farmers and the environment. Well, actually, no. Without the environment, there ain't no farming, chaps.
That's absolutely true. Henry, I must, before we leave this wonderful place, you've got another business, a small-scale business, but producing water or supplying water to the villages around here. And this gives you a particular interest in environmental contamination and purity of our water supply. How did this come about? How were you responsible for a water company?
Well, our great-grandfather set it up in 1904. We had our own Act of Parliament, the Chiltern District Water Company Act 1904. So basically we kept the job going over the years, and we've got our own system. We've got boreholes and reservoirs and distribution mains, and we look after about 2,000 people basically, and I think we do a reasonable job at it. But of course, as part of supplying water, it's obviously tested all the time. And 30 years ago, it was evident that our nitrate levels in the water were increasing. So I brought this to the attention of the authorities, and said that if this trend continues in about 20-something years, we're going to be failing on nitrates. Well, unfortunately, nothing was done about it. And so ultimately, we did start failing for nitrates. So we had to put this plant in here that's cost getting on for £500,000, and it costs something like 90,000 a year to run. So basically, all our water has to, or a percentage of our water has to go through this plant. It's treated before it can go out to our customers. And the EA have now got involved in finding out. They've got involved with trying to find out. So they did trial boreholes up and down the valley, and basically at the end of it, they found out that of the nitrate, 8% only was coming from my farming operation, of which 5% was due to a leaking slurry lagoon and a sensitive spot. So I had to spend an awful lot of money. We put a new slurry lagoon in, and this is for one of the dairy herds. And so basically it means that our contribution as an organic farm in this area is actually less than 3% of the nitrate in the water that we're giving to our customers, which I think is sustainable. The rest of it is all coming from sewage treatment works upstream of us and from intensive industrial agriculture immediately again upstream here. So it's coming, fertilizer is being spread on the fields to the north of us, and it's coming down the river valley, underwater of course, underground, subterranean, and then we're drawing it back up. I mean, it's no surprise, it's obvious, but it just shows that putting large amounts of nitrogenous fertilizer on agricultural land is entirely unsustainable.
And who's paying the £90,000 a year it costs to take that nitrate out of your drinking water?
Me and the customers. And the thing is, this is going to be a growing trend because there's more and more water being polluted all over the country.
So shouldn't that charge be on the polluters, the people who use the nitrate fertilisers? Maybe the nitrate fertiliser companies, shouldn't be a tax on that to pay the cost?
That sounds a good idea. But the trouble is that the people, the farmers that are using nitrogen fertiliser, they're doing nothing wrong. I mean, they're just doing what they've been told to do. They've been taught to do this at agricultural college, and they've been encouraged to do it by successive governments. Increase production.
Whatever the cost.
Whatever the cost.
Environmental cost.
That's right.
What's your view on that, Philip?
I think it's normalised madness, to be honest. The fact that we are faced with a generation of farmers, of stewards of the countryside that have been taught to farm in the way that they are, that have been encouraged through subsidy to farm the way that they are, despite the fact that it is destroying the very countryside that they're meant to be stewarding. Why do I say that? Well, I think that we can see that in the declines all around us. The farmland birds, the butterflies, the bees, whichever way you look at it, the countryside is in decline, and as the soils slip away under our feet, we'll realise that actually that normalised madness really should never have been.
Having seen a remarkable piece of countryside restoration, we're off to look at Henry's dairy cows. They're pretty remarkable too. Not only are they out grazing for much of the year, which is itself unusual these days, they're out on pastures that make their own nitrogen fertiliser. That's because they all contain plants known as legumes, clovers, red and white, sainfoin, which we've already heard about, and lucerne, which is very resistant to drought. All the winter silage is made from these same pastures, which means that these cows only get to eat forage that makes its own fertiliser by natural means. No chemical fertilisers are needed, which is good for the cows, good for the environment too.
Well, it's all high protein, so that they need very little. While they're grazing here, they don't actually need any additional protein at all. So we're making all our own protein, and as you can see, I mean, we've had an incredibly dry year, and it's flourishing. So there's no shortage of forage here. So because we're not relying on perennial ryegrass and nitrogenous fertilisers, it doesn't matter how much. That will only work if you get the right amount of rain. If you don't get rain, you're not going to get any forage. Whereas here, because they're deep rooting, we've got plenty of forage, in spite of the fact we've been incredibly dry.
And Philip Lymbery from Compassion in World Farming, you're looking at a farming system here which you must be delighted to see cows out on grass or pasture of one form, a leguminous pasture, basically through a long grazing season. Is this the kind of dairy farming you want to see?
It's an absolute joy, Graham, an absolute joy. Seeing animals out in their natural habitat, being able to do what they do best, which is grazing, and you're turning grass that we can't eat into milk that we can. And I very much see the future of the countryside for animal welfare and the environment, as well as nutrition, being about animals being kept on mixed rotational farms. And so I always say to consumers, if you want to help this kind of thing, then look out for pasture-fed, free-range or organic meat, milk and eggs. That's the way to go.
It is shocking. I go in my local supermarket, I look at, there's a whole variety of milks in there, and I know that almost all of them will at least have some of the milk in that carton will come from cows kept indoors perhaps all year round and fed really on what is an unnatural diet, high in cereals and energy and probably some imported protein.
The fact is that consumers are blindfolded. Other than eggs, eggs, if they've come from hens that have been kept in cages, then eggs have to be labelled eggs from caged hens. But for meat and milk, that's not the case. So that's why you get labels like fresh and farm fresh and country fresh and natural. And what those tend to mean is that the meat or the milk is fresh from the factory farm. So that's why my organisation, Compassion in World Farming, has been running a campaign called Labelling Matters, calling for all meat and milk to be labelled according to method of production, because I believe consumers do want to know where the food comes from. That they know instinctively that milk that comes from cows like these here in front of us that are allowed to graze on rich, verdant pasture produces better milk. It tastes better and it's nutritionally better for our families too.
What about the supermarket's role in this? I mean, they have not informed us about the nature of the food we're eating, the nature of the food on their shelves, have they? Otherwise, I mean, I made a film recently about how cows produce milk, and we did a sort of vox pop in Shaftesbury, which is a kind of country town really, and everybody we spoke to thought cows ate grass. And it came as a great shock to them to know that cows don't always eat grass, and sometimes they come from sheds and are fed on cereals. So while people think that, why shouldn't the supermarkets be informing them? They presumably see it as not their business to do that.
Well, supermarkets are often reluctant to give consumers the kind of information that we need. What they worry about is that if they label voluntarily their milk, for example, as being from a mega dairy, then rather than people coming into their supermarket and seeing, oh, that's from a mega dairy, they'll go off to Joe Bloggs' supermarket that isn't labelling and buy the self-same milk, but be happy because it's called fresh. So that's why supermarkets are reluctant to do this on a voluntary basis. The Co-op bucked the trend way back in the 90s, which is why we've got egg labelling, mandatory egg labelling in Britain and Europe. But it hasn't happened for meat, it hasn't happened for eggs. And it's about time that the government sorted this out. It can't be right. It can't go on any longer for consumers to be misled in the way that they are by the labelling as it is.
But you hear so many politicians going about the nanny state and telling people what to eat. Actually, it's telling people what real food is.
It is. That's decent labelling would enable people to make a real choice. What's happening at the moment is that we're getting the antithesis of the nanny state, where actually, because nannies like to look after people, like to look after their grandchildren, making sure that they get the best food. Yeah. What we're doing in our society is we're making it hard for people to get the best food. We're making the cheap and cheerless stuff that comes from factory farms, that's been produced by chemicals, and is poor in nutrition. We're making that readily available, we're making it cheap, and we're calling it fresh and farm fresh and natural. Yes, come and get me, this is good. it shouldn't be this way. So we do need to rethink about food, about the way we produce food, the way that food is sold, the way that we label food. And in this way we can really empower consumers to do what I think many consumers want to do, which is to buy the right thing. What is the right thing? Well, for my money, it's looking out for pasture-fed, free-range or organic.
Yeah, so in fact, to sum it all up, what we want is a farming revolution, but we want the whole, I won't just say consumers, we want the citizens of this country to join together with the farmers, with everyone else, to really transform the way we grow and produce our food and the way we look after our countryside. It's a job for all of us, is that right?
It is absolutely a job for us, and I think it has to be demanded by citizens, demanded by consumers, but delivered through the leadership of government and corporations and supermarkets. So we need Michael Gove, the DEFRA Secretary of State. He's in charge of food and farming. We need him to turn his very fine words into action and reform food and farming in this country, frankly, before it's too late.
And Henry, last word from you, what should our leaders do to help your kind of farming, which is obviously of huge benefit to the nation?
Well, that's the thing. We more education. People really have got to understand how their food is made, as Philip says, absolutely vital. And looking to the future, after all, farmers are custodians of the land, and so therefore they should be looking after the land. And that also means looking after the atmosphere, looking after groundwater, looking after everything to do with the countryside, looking after wildlife. And, we can do it. Farmers can do it. They just need to be pointed the right way. And, just growing these leguminous crops, not using nitrogenous fertilizers, that alone would have an amazing effect on helping to control global warming. So that's what we've got to do. We've got to cut down atmospheric CO2, we've got to cut down emissions, and we can use agriculture to achieve precisely that if it's pushed in the right direction.
What Henry Edmunds' farm shows us is that real food comes from farms that are rich in wildlife. Contrary to what we've been led to believe, chemically driven factory farms are as bad for us as they are for the natural world. If we want to eat well, we need to choose the types of farms that feed us. Join me next time in my search for real food.